I thought, how can you be an atheist? And he says, well, I just believe in matter. And I says, well, do you think? Is thought matter? And he said, oh, no.
That's actually a great argument.
Yeah. You immediately know there is more than matter and there's more than just laws and stuff, because you can think about it.
Dr. Michael Behe, welcome to Stunned by Scripture. This is a great honor for me to have you on. You have been a personal hero, and your work, your publications have had a huge impact on my own worldview, approach to reality, understanding of God's creative activity and nature. I read what's probably your most famous book, I would still think, Darwin's Black Box, came out in 1996. Well, I was, let's see, where would I have been at that time? I was in seminary, actually. Yeah, at seminary, at Calvin Seminary in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I remember this coming out, and I read it assiduously. Some of the technical parts of it were a bit tough sledding, I think is the expression, for me to get through when you're getting down to the very, the biochemical explanations of different biological changes in organisms. But I got the point. I understood the point, and irreducible complexity, a concept that you've become very much associated with. I understood that, and for a couple of years, there seemed like a springtime of openness well, I was an evangelical Protestant at the time, within evangelicalism, of openness to God's creative activity, and there was some excitement about design. And then it seemed like the institutions circled the wagons, and as you remarked earlier when we were conversing, the empire struck back.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thanks very much, John. It's great to be with you. Yeah, you're right. When I wrote Darwin's Black Box, this seemed pretty obvious to me, just that biochemistry was discovering a lot more elegance and complexity than we had thought before. And the book kind of was the first one that received a lot of attention, and it caught a lot of people by surprise. And so a lot of the media, which are now hostile to it, didn't know what their role was supposed to be. Right. So it was reviewed in the New York Times, reasonably favorably. It was reviewed in Nature magazine, which is the most prominent science journal in the world, and many other publications. My favorite is something called Aboard magazine, which was the in-flight magazine of the Bolivian National Airlines. In Spanish and English. It was
Wow.
It was great. So yeah, and so people didn't know how to react, but then, in my estimation, the idea started to catch on a little too much, and the natives started to get restless if you're a member of the establishment who is invested in this idea. And organizations organized to feed talking points to the press, to attack people who supported intelligent design. And so, yeah, it became something less to be discussed than something to be suppressed.
Right.
And I think we continue to be at that point.
Sure. Yeah.
Even now.
Yeah. There was the powers that be, persons who had a good deal of social power
Yes.
in large institutions decided that openness to design, which of course implies a designer, was a threat to the cultural narrative that they wanted to maintain.
And it's really also you're pretty vulnerable in science, especially if you're an up-and-coming student or doing your doctoral or postdoctoral work and looking for a job or don't have tenure yet.
Right.
there's a lot of people, there's a lot of competition, and if some taint of ID gets on you, then there can be
Right.
life-changing consequences.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You just don't have a career in
Yeah,
science.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that happened
Yeah.
to folks I knew.
Yeah. Yeah. I've witnessed that. Yeah. There was an attempt to get me fired
Oh, is that right? Oh dear.
from Franciscan University
Oh my.
because I didn't toe the line with evolutionary thought.
Oh
And
boy. Yeah.
so there's a very deep there's a deep reach.
Yeah. I talk to people. They say that unfortunately Catholic colleges are no different than,
Right.
than public colleges or private colleges in that, and
Yeah.
that's really amazing to me.
Yeah. No, I found that as well. There's not necessarily an openness to
Yeah.
design thinking in Catholic institutions, which is kind of ironic with our Thomistic heritage and all. But and anyway, well, we're getting way ahead of ourselves, Michael. But it's great to have you on, and just to reiterate, especially for the sake of our viewers, kind of the context of this. So this podcast done by Scripture, is my own podcast where I can deal with issues that impinge on the reading of Scripture. And of course, as an Old Testament scholar, I continually get dragged into discussions of creation, evolution, and so on because it impinges on the reading of Genesis 1 and 2 and other passages of Scripture, of course, that talk about God's creative agency in world history and so on. So from an early age, when I decided I eventually wanted to go into Scripture, I began, like I said, getting caught up into these discussions, and I've been following discussions of evolution, creationism, and then when I was a kid, there wasn't really an ID movement. That was probably subsequent. Would you say it was subsequent to the publication of your book? That an
Pretty
ID
much.
movement came?
Yeah, my book was the biggest opening shot. There were a few previous books. One was written by a man named Philip Johnson,
Sure.
who wrote Darwin on Trial, and that
I remember that.
got some notice. And even more previous to that, about 10 years in the middle 80s, a book called Evolution, A Theory in Crisis
Oh, by Denton.
by Michael Denton. Yeah, it was
Right.
an Australian geneticist, or geneticist working in Australia at the time.
Yeah.
So those kind of primed the pump. I read both of those, and they
In fact,
they
you do.
influenced me. And
Yeah.
I actually got to meet Philip Johnson and was kind of brought into his orbit, and that's what gave me the idea of writing a book. I figured, heck, if he could write a book, I could do that too.
You can write it too. That's great. Yeah. And then especially since you have such technical expertise, which is kind of difficult to impugn, although it has been impugned, but difficult to.
In the beginning,
Yeah.
but anything goes now.
Right. That gave some weight to your arguments because you're able to do these high-resolution discussions of biochemistry that I think Philip Johnson, for example, could not have done.
Yeah.
Although he saw a lot of truth.
It's interesting, in the New York Times review of the book, of about a week after it came out, the author said that for a working biochemist, this comes close to heresy. So it's not just that somebody wrote against evolution and made cogent arguments, but yeah, here's somebody from inside baseball making
Right.
the same arguments.
Right. Yeah. Not an outsider critiquing the science establishment, but a bench scientist
Yeah.
saying, "Hey, this doesn't really
We've
work
got a problem here
on the ground." Yeah. So anyway, the church gives us latitude, of course, on how to understand creation and evolution and the scriptural narratives. At least the church is giving us latitude now. By the guidance of the Holy Spirit, there may be future decisions by the magisterium that will constrain the discussion. But in the present moment, in the 21st century, the magisterium is permitting quite a wide discussion. So you have within Orthodox Catholicism, within people who are committed to staying in communion with the successor of Peter, and with the doctrinal standards set out by the Catechism. You have theistic evolutionists, you have ID proponents like yourself, and even young Earth creationists. And I see those as there's all kinds of variation within that, but I've always seen those as kind of the three main camps within Catholic intellectual circles. So on this podcast, I'm trying to have a Orthodox Catholic representative of each of those three camps on the show to present, the different perspectives, and between the different episodes, create a little bit of a dialogue between. And what I notice, and I'm sure you've noticed this as well, is we don't tend to talk with each other very much as Catholic intellectuals. We publish something and then we launch fusillades at each other, on our podcasts or other publication venues. But there's few forums where representatives of different camps can get together and have an exchange, a friendly and a cordial exchange. I think that's important. Matthew 18 says if you have an issue with your brother, go to your brother personally and try to work it out. And I know that's in the context of fraternal correction and a moral defect and so on, but I think that there's a strong analogy for that also in the Catholic intellectual life. And so, I fail to understand why, say, Catholic biologists who have different opinions on this wouldn't just call each other up on the phone and say, hey, Dr. Behe, I think that evolution works. I think you're wrong about irreducible complexity, and have a cordial conversation.
Yeah.
But this is not how things work. From my experience, for example, rather than somebody calling me up on the phone and finding out what I was teaching in class, I find out that proceedings have started against me through my administration from an agent outside the university to investigate whether my employment should continue.
Oh boy!
And so, why is this happening within Catholic circles?
Yeah.
It seems like we ought to be able to talk as brothers in Christ.
Yeah, it seems to be a little different from just non-Catholic groups who want to defend a particular position and try to undermine the other folks without regard to their personal circumstances. And yeah, it's really sad. There was a group recently organized, maybe 5-ish or 7-ish years ago, called Society of Catholic Scientists. And I thought, wow, I'm Catholic and I'm a scientist. So I wrote and said, hey, I'd like to join. And unfortunately, the organizers were organizing it so that it would exclude intelligent design. And folks who were known to be proponents of that were not permitted to join, an organization of Catholic scientists. And so it's not the way it should be, certainly.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Thinking of that, there are many Catholics who hold to a design perspective, and you and I both contributed to a recent publication from Sophia Institute Press, God's Grandeur, the Catholic Case for Intelligent Design. And you have a chapter in here on biochemistry, I believe. I have a chapter on design in Scripture. One of my colleagues at Franciscan, Dr. Logan Gage, with whom we just had lunch, he has a couple of chapters in here on different aspects of the philosophy of design. So we're out here. We're here, you can't shut us up.
That's right. There's a significant, and they're all, whatever you are persuaded or not, they're all intellectually serious.
Right.
People
earn doctorates in relevant fields.
Who know what they're talking about.
Right.
And for the life of me, I don't see why people react, negatively to arguments for intelligent design when it seems to me to fit with Catholicism in general and major strains of philosophical thought in Catholicism, like a hand in a glove.
Right. You would think that, we're just expanding on Thomas's fifth way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, although I've read some Thomas who try to argue that somehow the design arguments that I think you and I would favor somehow don't fall under Thomas's fifth way.
Well,
you have any thoughts on that?
I've read some of them because they say in his short explication of the fifth way, he talks about an archer sending an arrow to a target. And they say, well, that's just a general law, like the law of gravity. So yeah, okay, so things like that bespeak design, but he didn't talk about, oak trees coming from acorn. Wait, he did talk about that. And then it kind of, gets more and more vague, I think.
Right.
I'm no philosopher, but Thomas Aquinas, does write about how when we see a ship, that we can recognize the design in the ship. So there are certainly many parts of his writings that are quite compatible with modern ideas, but
of recognition of design in objects. I've read some of these critiques as well, and have not been able to understand them. And even though like multiple readings, I'm like, what is going on? What is the author trying to say? And I think it's because there's a lack of clarity of thought, actually. I think that, the simple case is Thomas was arguing that the evidence of design in nature points to a mind, and that's the same thing that you and I would be doing by pointing to these natural.
Yeah, it's extremely important that in these discussions you gotta define your terms and stuff
right.
Really up front. Not only evolution, what that is, and how it differs in different mechanisms, different modes, but also mind and chance and all sorts of other fuzzy concepts. You've got to nail those down, or you're just going to go round and round without reaching any conclusion.
Serious progress, yeah. Good, and we're going to get to some of those, but first things first. And on the show, we always begin by allowing the guest to talk about their own spiritual journey, their own walk with God, where that began, how that developed, major influences in your life, in your own faith life. So to the degree that you're comfortable, tell us about that. What was your upbringing like? Was your spiritual journey, did you wander away from the faith? Did you come back? Things like this.
Okay, well, I was born into a large Catholic family. I'm one of 8 kids, and my mom and dad were both from large Catholic families in Altoona, Pennsylvania.
Oh, sure.
And my grandfathers both worked for the railroad in Altoona, and they came, so I'm from a long lineage of Catholic families. And my parents were devout, and they raised us all to be devout. We all went to Catholic schools, grade schools and high school. It wasn't until college that I was at a non-Catholic institution of education. So that was my world, and I thought it was just wonderful. I thought, even as a kid, it all made sense to me. So I grew up, and I should say all my brothers and sisters are practicing Catholics now.
Wow.
And
all 8 of you?
Yeah, all 8.
Wow. Good.
Yeah. So I went to Catholic grade school and high school, and I do remember, though, in grade school, in some biology class or other, one of the Sister David Marie talking about evolution and saying, well, God can make life any way he wants to, and if he wants to do it using natural laws, that's fine, with us. And well, okay, what do I care,
Right.
So I never gave it any thought. And in high school, I started to become interested in science, and I didn't know which science to pursue. Excuse me, but eventually I decided on chemistry because I wanted to know how the world works.
Right.
And everything's made of molecules, and that's what chemistry studies. So heck, yeah.
Why not physics?
Yeah, well, because it's
Too abstract?
No, it's too basic. It doesn't
basic,
quite
okay.
quite get the building blocks of what we see in nature.
Okay, sure.
It's a little too fundamental. It's like studying bricks instead of buildings.
Okay, sure.
So I went off to Drexel University is where I went to college to study chemistry, majored in chemistry. And there again, I was away from home for the first time, still practicing Catholic, but the college didn't have much of a Catholic community. I tried to make some friends, but the people weren't interested in me. So I was kind of on my own. And then I would have conversations with an atheist who was in my dorm hall, and I thought, how can you be an atheist? And he says, well, I just believe in matter. And I says, well, do you think? Is thought matter? And he said, oh, no. So I thought, yeah. So
that's actually a great argument.
Yeah. So for somehow that always struck me as you immediately know that there is more than matter and there's more than just laws and stuff because you can think about it.
Was that just a kind of an innate concept that you had?
Yeah.
I mean, that's brilliant. I mean, it takes some people years to come to figure that out.
Yeah, I don't remember ever being taught it. But it
just seemed
natural.
obvious. Yeah.
And but in college, I wandered away from the faith because I had some friends and we looked to join a fraternity, and we joined one called Sigma Alpha Mu, and it was only later that I found out why it's a Jewish fraternity. Wait a second,
you accidentally joined a Jewish fraternity.
Yeah. And then I realized why my friends are Jewish too. I didn't know that. I actually didn't know any Jewish people
growing up.
I grew up in Catholic, schools, and that's who our friends were. At public events and stuff, I met Protestant kids, and but never Jewish folks, and so that was my first experience of that. And so they didn't care about nurturing my Catholic faith when I joined, and I kind of just
stopped practicing.
Through laziness, stopped practicing, and just remember one morning I woke up on a Sunday and I'm tired, and I went back to sleep. And from then on, I didn't go to Mass or the sacraments for a couple years, I guess.
Yeah.
But I graduated and went to University of Pennsylvania, which is actually pretty much across the street from Drexel.
From Drexel, yeah.
And I think I got an apartment on my own. And from being on my own, I started to think more, I wasn't as distracted as with fraternity life. And so I had this urging inside me saying, let's get it together here. And at one point I said, I have to get back to the church. And I went to confession and was it's always wonderful to come back after you've been so it was never an intellectual dispute or anything. It's just stupid laziness and distraction. And but then I came back and was interested in the faith, and and started reading a number of books. I remember reading Dietrich von Hildebrand,
Sure.
who was a prominent theologian from the mid 20th century, and
Yes. Very
related.
popular up here.
Oh, is that right?
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
okay, great. And I think I met his wife Alice von
Yes.
Hildebrand once, and
We have a Hildebrand Institute, Franciscan.
Oh, okay, okay. So he's still
yeah, his
thought
thoughts,
about, and his
yeah,
thought is still.
well appreciated, yeah. And you met Alice Van Hilden?
Yeah, just she was giving a talk. I went up and said hi.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, it was great to see her, and so I became active again in the church. And then after graduating, I went to Bethesda, Maryland, to do a postdoctoral work at the National Institutes of Health,
Sure.
and joined the local parish, Our Lady of Lourdes, got involved with groups there. And so I've been a practicing Catholic, except for that several year
hiatus.
period. So that was my, it's not as interesting as many folks'
Right.
story, not as dramatic. But that one thing, one very providential event in my life, which is that at the end of my work at the NIH, I got a job in New York City at a place called Queens College, which is part of the city university system. And I was reading a magazine, and they had ads and personals at the ends, and I saw one that advertised something called the New York Catholic Forum, which was a group for young Catholics in their 20s and 30s. And I said, hey, I'm in my 20s. So when I moved there, I looked them up, and I got involved with a choir there, a Catholic choir called Musica Pro Domino. But the big thing is that they had a party one October, and I was talking to a buddy from the choir, and in the door walked this vision of loveliness, this raven-haired Italian lady with this beautiful green scarf, and I was stunned. And I said to my friend, "You know her?" He said, "Oh, you mean Celeste? Oh yeah. You want me to introduce you? Yeah." And the rest is history.
That's how you met
We've
your
been married
wife.
42 years now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So and Celeste herself was just back to the faith a year or so previously, and so we, of course, hit it off very well, and she has, been my soulmate for a
Yes.
while, and we've tried to raise our kids in the faith. We've homeschooled them, and so those are the major points in my life. The rest is just playing things out.
Right. Yeah, I've often thought that you'd fit in well in Steubenville with a Catholic family of 9 children homeschooling. That's that's kind of typical.
Yeah,
in the
that's
area.
great.
I have 8. We
Yeah,
homeschooled.
that's great. Yeah.
The majority of the time. And,
Yeah.
But why did you choose to homeschool? Interesting.
Well, that's a good question, and I was always expecting that we'd send our kids to St. Teresa's of Child Jesus Parish School just a mile down the street. But my wife said that no, the more she thought about it, the more she wanted to make sure that the kids were close at hand and that we had a much more direct oversight of what they were learning.
Yeah.
And so, actually, even before our oldest daughter, Grace, was set to go to first grade, we had signed her up for a preschool at a neighboring Lutheran church. But before she went there, my wife said, "No, I don't want to do that." And so, so we stopped that, and then the rest, the pattern was established. And my saintly wife, Celeste, has taught all of them with minor assistants for myself.
Uh-huh.
And they've all grown up and
Wow.
gone to college, and so
Sure.
their education was
Did they make the transition successfully between homeschooling and college?
oh sure,
Yeah.
yeah. 4 of them went to Lehigh.
Okay.
I'm a
Where you
professor,
teach?
yeah, where I teach, and 5 went to Catholic colleges.
Okay.
2 went to Christendom College in
Oh, yeah.
Virginia. 1 to Ave Maria. Another to
Usual suspects.
Belmont Abbey
Yes,
in
yes.
North Carolina, and another to Thomas Aquinas College in Massachusetts.
And,
So-
and we failed to attract any of them to Franciscan.
Well, actually, you had a shot at a couple of them, but
Yeah, lost.
yeah, didn't pan out.
Okay. Well, that's fine. Yeah, so those are all sister institutions with whom we have much affection and affinity, and professors circulate from
Yeah,
Franciscan out to
yeah.
those schools and back, and that's that's fantastic. So, do you happen to recall what curriculum Celeste used, or did she make her own? I just think of this because
For much of the time, she used the Seton home studies.
Yeah.
That's, of course, that was associated with Christendom or
Yeah.
groups there, and then I think she, for a couple of years, the Mother of Divine Grace
Yeah.
curriculum.
Yeah.
And after a while, she got pretty frisky and said, "I can do this too." And she just, she put things together on her own.
Yeah.
Yeah, but those were the days when there weren't as many homeschoolers back
Sure.
then. The hard work of making things legal had already been done, so
Yeah.
we weren't usually threatened with arrest.
Weren't usually.
Yeah. One time we got a letter from the school board saying, we reserve the right to make surprise visits to your home to make sure you're
Right.
you're on the up and up here. But there was a wonderful thing called the Homeschool Legal Defense Association.
Yes. Longtime members. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's for $100 a year, so
Yes.
they'll write a letter to your school board for you.
A threatening
with
letter.
Esquire at the bottom,
Right.
and say, don't do this or we'll see you in court. And,
Right.
and we never heard from the school board
Yeah.
again.
I just don't want to
Yeah.
mess with that. Yeah, very similar story. Very my own wife kind of went through development with those very homeschool curriculums, Seton and Mother
Yeah.
Divine Grace, and then finally in the later years deciding that I've done this long enough, I can make up my own curriculum.
I'm a pro now.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so you'd fit in well here in Steubenville, even though you're on the other side of Pennsylvania. Out there. That's great. So in your journey, Mike, did you ever feel a conflict between Catholic faith and the doing of science?
In all of my training and all the way up until I guess 1996, I didn't see any conflict.
There's no
between-
conflict.
No, I thought they meshed great. That they together made sense. That the world is ordered. That there are laws, regularities. And I saw as just trying to help science figure out how it worked. We knew it was rational. We knew there was an order beneath things.
Yeah.
So what is this order? And I went from chemistry to biochemistry, which studies the molecules of life. I never did. I remember doing my postdoctoral studies at the National Institutes of Health. I shared a laboratory space with another postdoc named Joanne Nickel, and she was a devout Catholic too. Her brother was a priest, and we were just doing the same work as everybody else was. And I've recounted this story a couple times that she and I were in a lab once saying, oh, okay, yeah, so, this is great. Life unfolds, so how do you think life started? And I says, well, of course you need nucleic acids. She says, yeah, well, you need, proteins too. Nucleic acids can. I said, yeah, well, you need a cell membrane to close. And she's, yeah, but you need metabolism to. And we kind of looked at each other and said, nah. This,
it didn't happen by chance.
This ain't going to happen.
Right.
But the funny thing was she and I then just kind of laughed and turned and went back to our bench.
Right.
And we didn't say, well, maybe there's something serious here that we should point out. And I think we were infected with this same kind of, I'm not quite sure what to call it, theistic evolutionary view, maybe something like that, or the overall paradigm that life must have just unfolded under normal physical laws, even though God may have anticipated that or planned it. And when we saw that it didn't work, well, we figured somebody else would probably figure it out or something,
Yeah.
But it never spurred us to action. So it's interesting. I've reflected on this a few times. The assumptions that you bring to your work can greatly influence what seems to be a problem and what you just kind of shrug off. And that was something we just shrugged off at the time.
Yeah. So you weren't deeply concerned with questions of evolution at that time.
No, actually, at that time, I can tell you later, I was, I guess, what you'd call a theistic evolutionist.
Sure.
I figured, hey, I'm Catholic. I can believe in this stuff.
Right. Yeah.
I actually had some evangelical Protestant friends who thought evolution was wrong, and I used to make fun of them. This is obvious. Everybody believes this.
Right. It's so obvious. Right.
Yeah. No, we didn't. I didn't. That was not on my radar. Evolution was not on my radar.
It wasn't on your radar, but you're a good bench scientist, and your Catholic colleague was as well. Mm-hmm. And so this conversation comes up, the origin of life. And you start putting together the pieces that would have to be in place, and it's irreducibly complex. Which is your catchphrase of later. You realize, we need lipids, we need carbohydrates, we need nucleic acids. I'm missing something here. Sugars, I think. Did I say carbohydrates?
Proteins.
Proteins, yeah, proteins. We need all these components, and they don't naturally occur, certainly not in a chiral form, which that's another thing to throw in there. We need them to all be homochiral, which means all have the same handedness. And they don't, those compounds don't naturally form in the ambient environment. In fact, it's really hard to get them to form. It seems like nature doesn't want them to form. And when you look at it, a lot of those compounds are formed molecule by molecule in the cell by nanotechnology that's been designed to do that. And when we try to make them in the lab, we're kind of like the Jolly Green Giant trying to make a house by pouring concrete and bricks and 2x4s down and then shaking it up. That's never going to happen because life really requires, a carpenter down at that nano level to actually join the 2x4s together and lay the bricks. And it's not going to happen by just stirring it all up. And so anyway, I don't know if you've been following the cultural phenomena that is James Tour on YouTube at all, but he kind of waded into this whole thing and has been.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I met Jim Tour. Let's see, a couple years after my book Darwin's Black Box came out. He was interested in it. He invited me to. He was at the University of South Carolina at that point, and I went down to give a talk there. He got in trouble for doing it. But yeah, he's a wonderful guy for um, other folks, he's an organic chemist,
Right.
and he's a world-class organic chemist. And one of his things that he does is take organic molecules, put them together with great care to make nano machines. I think he's made things like little cars,
Little cars, yeah.
with aromatic, benzene-like wheels and stuff. And he says, "You're trying to tell me that you can just, get lightning and have these things come together and make life? That's ridiculous." And he's speaking not as a Christian; he's a very devout Christian,
Hmm.
but as an organic chemist,
Yeah.
he's ticked off that these guys are telling the public, misleading the public into believing that it's not a big deal
Yeah.
that molecules could get together and form life.
Yeah.
As you were talking about, I was flashed in my mind that we're talking about this in the year 2026, and it was the year 1953, I believe, when a guy named Stanley Miller
Yeah.
did the primordial experiment where he took the glass globe and filled it with gases, methane and ammonia and water, and sparked it and got some amino acids, and that was splashed all over the newspapers and so on. And that was coming up on 75 years or so, and we haven't the foggiest idea how life started. And it's not for lack of trying. Lots of people have tried. They can't even conceive other than in cartoon form how life could arise. People read that, or the headline says, the DNA, bases or amino acids formed by this or that. What they don't tell you or distract you from is that they do something and a bunch of tar forms. And if you search the tar
right.
very closely, you can find a molecule here or a molecule there of the things that you're interested in, plus a ton of other things that people wave away.
Right.
But the real problem with life and biology in particular is organizing, arranging all of these parts for the purpose that they are needed to serve.
Yeah.
And you don't get that from lightning and such.
Yeah, and there's such ignorance of the complexity of life. So you probably saw, like in the past week, there was a splash on the news cycle of some DNA bases were found on a meteorite.
Yeah.
So there's okay, origin of life solved.
Yeah.
Like, wait a sec, amino acids. It's like finding some Scrabble letters and saying, "Oh, the works of Shakespeare."
Yeah.
Now we have the solution because we found some letters, some Scrabble pieces.
Yeah.
There's the layer and layer of complexity that life needs is truly mind-boggling. It takes years and years to understand what proteins are doing, what enzymes are doing, what's going on, and there's a lot of magical thinking in the press, in the public, and it seems to me that magical thinking is encouraged and promoted, and many people in the educational establishment aren't really interested in having people understand truly how complex even the simplest of living things is. All the error correction mechanisms that are going on even inside of bacteria, which are often thought of as some of the simplest things that are out there.
Yeah, that's one thing that really gets my goat, is that these folks are actively misleading students, little kids, in their classes, their biology classes, to believe things that are true that professional scientists either know are false or very tendentious or much more complicated than the simple stories that these kids are being fed, and that this is being done so that they will adopt a worldview that gives the least amount of trouble to the scientific establishment. I think it was either C.S. Lewis or G.K. Chesterton who said that that problem with education is exactly that kids are being taught to choose a side when they don't even know that there are, active arguments about a number of different options.
Right.
We
Going
see
on.
that
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. Already being kind of groomed to adopt an atheistic and materialistic worldview
Right.
without knowing that there's an active argument going on among intellectuals and that there's reasons, on the other side. Yeah, and in being encouraged to believe in extraordinary myths like lightning hits a pond of organic goo and an amoeba crawls out. I mean, essentially, that's they won't say that outright, but in these movies that you see at natural history museums, that's kind of what's trying to be suggested. Even though we got the water problem, right, which is that water degrades all these organic molecules if you just let them sit in water. So how are they going to form in a substance that degrades them? Water can be lethal. Water's got to be managed in the cell very carefully because it can kill you if it reacts with certain things, and then lightning, which I forget what the exact number of gigavolts that lightning. So you can unleash lightning onto a pond. Lightning. When has lightning never caused life? They don't encourage you to run around on the golf course waving your 9-iron in the air when there's a thunderstorm, right? Like, give me life, give me life.
Well, I read once that was all changed when Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, and had lightning coursing through dead matter, and all of a sudden it came to life. And modern scientific ideas aren't too much different from that. They have about the same level of detail as was in the story of Frankenstein.
Sure.
But that it's just that, there's this mysterious stuff, electricity and dead matter, and that's mysterious too. Maybe if we combine them, it'll give us life.
Yeah, it is a kind of a magical thinking, mysterious. Yeah, it's on so many levels. Well, good. So we kind of heard your spiritual story, and growing up in a kind of sounds like an ideal kind of Catholic environment, very supportive, very cohesive. Not seeing any reason to reject that, except for laziness for a couple of years. Finding a wonderful Catholic wife, and then trying to replicate that in your own lives, raising your own children to appreciate the faith. I'm glad you made the comments. One of my goals in these podcasts is to help young people who may be watching understand that there is no conflict between the life of faith and the scientific life, but a hostility is promoted in our culture. There's a famous line, I think it was from the movie Nacho Libre. I don't know if you've seen this.
It doesn't ring a bell.
It's a crazy screwball comedy. And but at one point, one of the characters says, "I believe in science," as opposed to his friend who wants him to be baptized. And so it always this, "I believe in science." So there is a cultural myth that science and religion are in opposition to one another.
Yeah.
Have you seen that with your students that you've taught over the years?
I haven't spoken with them much about it, but some certainly do. I've gotten a few kids coming around and worrying about this. I remember one student at one talk who said, but chimps and humans, they've got like 99%, it was at the time, that number has changed, have 99% genetic similarity. And he was clearly struggling with this, and it was actually, he was a Jewish student. It was a kind of a ecumenical get together, and I was invited to speak there. I says, well, maybe, but you can think about that two ways. If that's the case, then the genetic similarity is a real poor indicator of the biology of these two species. You can tell a difference between a human and a chimp, and it looks like it's more than 1%. And the other thing is that, well, okay, 1%, but there are 3 billion nucleotides in the human/chimp genome, and 1% of that is like 30 million. So you're saying there's 30 million differences between them. And when, I said a couple other things too, but you can see his face light up as you show him perfectly, reasonable observations that don't appeal to, religious, doctrines or anything.
Yeah.
And to see that, well, he was being misled. He was being led down the primrose path to believe something that was, not nearly as clear as he had been led to believe.
Sure. With a kind of an end goal of a kind of at the end of that chain of thought, well, we're 99% chimp. Well, therefore what? And I guess it is, well, we're just animals, I suppose. It's a line of thought that's trying to argue or end up in a philosophical and a theological position to say that human beings aren't unique or don't have a unique role in creation, and therefore perhaps are accidental, or religious teaching that emphasizes the uniqueness of the human being, like, for example, in the image of God. That can't possibly be true because we're just 99% animal. But
I think another big piece of it is that, at least in the common telling, this means that evolution, quote unquote, is true, and evolution is generally packaged as being random and purposeless. And so if this is true, then these guys are right, and there is no purpose to life.
There's no purpose.
It just happened this way. And so not only are you an animal, but who cares what animals are? They're just accidents too.
Right. Yeah. Big Bang was an accident. The coalescence of the Earth was an accident. Just a long chain of accidents that don't have us in mind, etc.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Good. Well, let's again, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but a couple of minutes ago, you said that when we approach these questions, we should define our terms and kind of make clear what we're talking about. So we've already talked about the supposed conflict between science and religion, but why don't we spend some time just talking about what is science? I'm sure you've engaged that question before and had to come up for yourself with a definition or at least an attitude of what it is that science does and what your vocation is as a scientist, et cetera, what makes science different from other modes of knowing or other kinds of human activities. So why don't we camp out there for a little bit and talk about what do we mean by science in modern terminology?
Well, excuse me. By science, I view science as the study of the material world, okay, and a systematic, detailed study to figure out how things work, where things came from, and pretty much that. Physics is the paradigm of sciences. You can study a billiard ball and how it rolls, and you can come up with descriptions of that. Oppose that to, say, philosophy, where you abstract from many of the things that we see, different principles or different characteristics, and you treat them as characteristics and try to understand them in an intellectual fashion. I separate science from mathematics. Mathematics is a study of logical relationships. Logic is not the same as science. You can't prove logic in a test tube. There are lots of levels of rationality that are more foundational, more basic than science. Science builds on a bunch of those.
So math and logic would be more basic
Exactly.
than natural science.
And keep that in mind, because when they conflict, sometimes science will deny an aspect of rationality or try to, because it doesn't fit what some people think should be in science. So at that point, you have to say, well, science is wrong because these aspects of thinking are more fundamental. And if you abandon these aspects of rationality, you are abandoning thought. Yeah. And that's not the way to go. But it's interesting that there have been battles in the history of science over what science is.
Sure.
And one I like to point to is Newton's theory of gravity. Back in the day when he was studying the planets and how they move and so on, he came up with his law of gravity that, hey, maybe this gravity that we see on Earth is also acting in space, and we can describe that. People said, what is gravity? And and he famously wrote something. I think the phrase is hypothesis non fingo. It means I don't give any explanation. I do not feign a hypothesis.
Okay.
It's just two objects that are attracting or repelling each other from a distance. And when he said it was like a force acting at a distance, that caused alarm bells to go off in his contemporaries, because they, in Newton's day, it was thought that two bodies had to interact, had to hit each other in order to affect each other. There couldn't be this action at a distance stuff. But nonetheless, he didn't care. And it was so youthful, his relationship, that people worked with it anyway. And you could say that we still don't quite understand what gravity is. You know, there are proposals and different explanations, but the point was that people thought that even Newton's theory of gravity was not scientific to some. And another example is the Big Bang theory. You know, back in the 19th century, people thought that the universe was eternal and unchanging, and then it was seen that galaxies, gave off a redshift, and it seemed to be receding from the Earth and from each other as if in the aftermath of a giant explosion. And that was the start of the Big Bang theory. And if you run that backwards in your mind, then you come to a first point and a beginning. And that struck many physicists as pointing to a creation event. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And many physicists hated that idea. And there was a guy named Nernst, I've forgotten his first name, a German chemist named Nernst, who wrote to this philosopher lecturing him, saying, science requires an eternal universe. So any proposal that it had a beginning is not, by definition, non-scientific.
Interesting.
So the Big Bang, if that, I'd like to point out that if that advice had been followed, the Big Bang theory would have been ruled out from the beginning, and people would still be trying to figure out these red shifts in an eternal universe.
Right.
And a lot of progress that otherwise had been made would have been nipped in the bud.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is particularly relevant because you've worked for decades with the concept of design, and then there's a lot of folks who say, oh, we can't talk about design in science.
Right, yeah.
Although in actuality, I think most chemists, biologists talk about design almost every day. Every time you're looking at the cell, you're thinking, this is for that. This enzyme is has a purpose, and if you read the literature, purposeful language is used all the time in the biological sciences.
I'd like to point out also that we see design and we see intelligence in our everyday worlds, just like Newton saw gravity acting in his everyday world. He couldn't define gravity. I can't define intelligence. I'm not a philosopher. Nobody knew what could cause a universe to explode into existence in the Big Bang Theory, but they said, hey, all these patterns look like an explosion. Why don't we run with it? And we'll figure these things out later. Yeah. I might be getting ahead of ourselves again, but what science has discovered at the very foundation of life and at all levels above that too, sure looks like the purposeful arrangement of parts. It sure looks like design and things that are much more elegant or complex than we ourselves are capable of making. So we see design, we know design, and yet we're being told, no, you're not allowed to think that way.
Yeah.
And that seems utterly arbitrary to me. I didn't get into science to be told, no, don't believe your lying eyes. You have to follow this rule that somebody wrote down.
Yeah. It reminds me of the oohs and ahs that I think it's Drew Barry from Harvard, who's an animator of microscopic molecular activity, and has done a bunch of TED Talks where he's shown his animations of what's actually going on at the molecular level in the cell. And he'll show the chains of DNA coming in and crossing one another, and the error correction mechanisms and the replication mechanisms that's going on, all of which looks like the most sophisticated technology that you could possibly find in a factory. Beyond what we're doing on assembly lines. With all these enzymes and other nanomolecular machines coming in to splice in, healthy stretches of DNA where there's been damage done, and when this is shown in public, and people are watching, this, they're just dumbstruck by because it screams coordination. It screams purposefulness. It screams intelligence. Because, as you say, what's going on there, it would be a challenge or even beyond our own abilities as human beings to design a manufacturing process like this, especially going on at such a tiny level.
Jim Tor is green with envy.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. And so it's a natural intuition, even among lay people, when that's actually displayed, that, oh my goodness, something very miraculous is going on. Of course, the audiences at TED Talks aren't encouraged to continue the thought process as to where that leads, which would eventually be to a God and to a creator. But they would probably phrase it as, wow, when I watched it, I sensed the mystery of the universe, or something like that. Really what they're getting is an intuition of God's presence. But we're not, that's the G word, and we're not permitted to say that in public.
Usually in things like that, if you are permitted to observe things like that, then somebody grabs the hand of this guy in a white lab coat and pulls them out and says, oh yeah, we know that you're impressed. Let me tell you, isn't it wonderful what evolution has done for us?
Right, yeah.
And essentially, in my completely unbiased opinion, papers over the design and the problems with evolutionary theory in describing such things and accounting for them. People are actively discouraged from making such connections.
Yeah. Now, would you agree that science is the quest for the truth about the material world? Could that be a way of defining what science is?
Well, it's wonderful that you brought that up. I think I would say that. I myself would say that, but I mentioned Philip Johnson a little while back, and he always said that there are two definitions of science. One is an unimpeded search for the truth about the material world. The second is the best application of materialist philosophy to what we observe. And that's what happens when somebody tells you you're not allowed to conclude design. That's the second definition of science taking over. And he always wanted to, as he said, drive a wedge between those two definitions. Let's separate, materialist philosophy from what is the best explanation for what we see.
Right. So adopting a materialist philosophy, which, for our viewers, that is a materialist philosophy would be a way of looking at the world that disallows any non-material explanations for the realities that we observe. But you would say science doesn't need to adopt that restriction. That's kind of like putting a handcuff on.
That's right.
on
I
the
understand
mind.
science as a no-holds-barred search for the truth about the physical world.
Even if that might lead us to speculate about non-material causes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
After all, we don't know what is material and non-material. And,
We don't have good definitions of these things.
What are the types of things that can exist? And if we rule them out in advance, then science is stuck.
Yeah, and this is true. If you study the history of quantum mechanics as well, Einstein objected to a lot of things that were later kind of verified as the discipline of quantum mechanics developed. Like I thought you were going to mention. You mentioned action at a distance with gravity. Then with the quantum mechanical revolution, there was spooky action at a distance, which is this reality that particles can get in what we call entangled with one another, and thereafter they might be half the width of the galaxy apart, and something done to one particle will immediately have an effect on the other particle with which it's entangled, regardless of the spatial differential between them.
So much for the speed of light.
Yeah. So much for the speed of light, and Einstein did not like that at all. He did not like the spooky action, and a number of other things about quantum mechanics he didn't like, and he had arguments with the other early founders of quantum physics and stuff about this. But despite his reputation as the world's smartest man, Einstein was on the wrong end of a number of those arguments for theological and philosophical reasons. He didn't like the view of the universe that was emerging from quantum mechanics, which is a view of the world, I would say, that's much more open to the role of the mind and the role of observation, in particular, in the dynamics of what's going on, even physically. So some of the phenomena that we observe at the level of the very small, which is what quantum mechanics is. Some of the phenomena we observe there show that there is a interaction between mental activity and the physical world, where our mental choices make a difference in what happens physically. And Einstein didn't like that.
Yeah, well, he's one of the ones that didn't like the Big Bang.
He didn't like the Big Bang either.
He actively tried to stop it too. As with his cosmological constant.
And Father Lemaitre. And, so,
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to ask you about the search for. So you would say it's a no holds barred search for truth about the material reality. And is there any? Yeah, I think you already defined it. You said no holds barred. So everything is on the table when we talk about science. There's no aspects of science that are embarrassing or that are politically incorrect, or we can't talk about that.
You just bring your evidence, and we'll talk about the evidence.
Okay. So we could talk about the Cambrian explosion, and we could talk about
the origin of life.
These things that are politically incorrect. Okay. and as a Catholic and as a scientist, do you see any opposition between scientific reality and believing in things like the spirit world, the angelic, the demonic, our own spirits?
No, I certainly don't. I believe in God. God is spirit. There may be other spirits, that He made. I've said before, for me, it always comes back to the realization that I've got a mind, and the mind
Right.
is not physical.
Right.
So there, other non-physical things are, very likely to exist, because my mind is not going to be the only thing that exists.
Right.
So I have never had any difficulty thinking that those were the cases. Now, if you're going to ask about, well, do these spirits have effects on the physical world and stuff? Well, you can get a interesting mix of physical evidence for your theories, or maybe it's just particular one-off situations where things seem to have been affected, or it might be a series of interesting incidents like these near-death experiences that people talk about. But let's bring them all, and let's talk about them here.
Yeah, we could talk about it. Yeah, there was a well-documented case of exorcism in Gary, Indiana, about 10 years ago, that began with two elementary school boys walking backwards up the wall of a hospital triage room, and then standing on the ceiling, and then jumping from the ceiling to the floor, and flashing an evil grin at the adults who were present.
That'll make you suspicious.
Yeah. So the mother, the grandmother, a security guard, a social worker, and a nurse all witnessed this. And then there was various paranormal activity going on in their home. Eventually, the family, which was not Catholic, sought out the help of the Catholic Diocese of Gary, and the diocesan exorcist was sent, and he successfully exorcised the family members. I don't think the property. I think the property was just abandoned because there was paranormal activity going on in the property. But anyway, many Orthodox Catholics have no problem with believing in exorcisms and demonic activity, where the demon is an immaterial person, an intelligence that does not have a body, but the demons will directly affect material reality, and at the same time, there seems to be a real resistance among Catholic intellectuals to allow God to directly affect material reality. So when I've put forward, for example, design arguments, or argued that that maybe that biological life could be specially created in certain places, oh no, God doesn't work like that,
Just Satan works.
Yeah,
like that.
apparently just Satan works like that.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that our faith, all the phenomena that because the church fully endorses exorcism, and every diocese has an exorcist, and these kind of phenomena are reported, and they're in the literature, and so on. So the church, it seems, in our faith recognizes that the immaterial, that the spiritual can impact the material and the physical. And so anyway,
I was just going to say, I think that the dividing line is that you can't say anything or believe something that would affect a discipline of study. The folks in colleges and universities, they've got their like trade unions. They control discussion about these things. So if you say, why I was present in a room and a book flew across the room, or there was some physical manifestation. Anybody will let you believe that. They might pat you on the head. Or you might, say that, there's these near-death experiences. And well, some people will wave it away, but as long as you don't say, no, you guys are barking up the wrong tree with this whole line of study where you got these grants to
Right.
to explain this, and no, it's this other way. Then you get jumped on with both feet. Then now you're affecting organized, livelihoods.
I thought you were going to say organized crime.
Yeah, well, and there are folks who who will then move in an organized way to put a stop to it. And they'll do it for folks in Catholic colleges as well as folks in public universities. You can't control what the unwashed masses think, but you can have a Rolodex. I'm showing my age. You can have a Rolodex of reporters for great metropolitan newspapers who you can call up and say, this is what science says about this thing that some story arose about. And you can get the organs of information to repeat the standard story. So it's real hard to catch on if you're going to make a general claim about the unfolding of life and not just particular claims.
Yeah. That's right. So you can spread information anecdotally, and you can have private beliefs, but when you mount truth claims that might threaten, especially funding mechanisms, but other kinds of entrenched academic mechanisms, then you're going to provoke a big response from people that have social power. I would agree to that. Okay, let's move on to talking about Darwinism for a few minutes. And I think, it's been my experience teaching undergrads and graduate students over the years. Periodically I teach a course on faith and science. And my students are well educated and well motivated and come from good educational institutions. When they come to Franciscan, they've had training in Franciscan. But they're often remarkably confused at what evolution is, what Darwinism is, how Darwinism is different than other kinds of ideas about evolution, because there are other forms of evolution, at least historically. Neo-Darwinism has won the day currently, but there's Lamarckianism, there's vitalism, and so on. So can you talk to us a little bit about what is Darwinism and what makes it unique from other proposals that have been put forward in the history of philosophy and science about gradual developments of animals?
Well, Darwinism, I think, is the defining concept of it is natural selection. At least Darwin thought of that as his baby, the idea of natural selection. And that is that in any population of organisms, birds or fish or something, you'll have variation. He said you can see that, you can observe it. And if some variation gives a member of the species an edge, it's better, then the odds are, probability, it will survive longer than the ones that don't have that variation and have more opportunities to mate and leave offspring. And that means that the next generation will have more of that variation in it than the previous one. And if that still is in effect, then the next generation will have even more if they still have the edge, and the next one more until it takes over. And then, so now it's fixed in the species. It's the whole thing. Now maybe another variation will come along, and the whole process will repeat. And then over long iterations of this, you'll go from some species that had, from a starting point to maybe something pretty different or at the end. So he saw his idea as natural selection as the engine of evolution. Evolution itself, the word has a number of connotations. One trivial connotation is just change over time. So people talk about the evolution of movies or the evolution of, tastes in food or something. But in Darwin's sense, it means the change in the average properties of a species over time. And in his book, or The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, he had just one diagram, and he drew this little tree-like structure where he starts with a line and it branches into two, and then one goes along and it can branch two. And the idea was that, well, maybe some of the species go over the mountain in this direction, and they have a variation that the ones that stayed behind didn't. And so over time, those lines of descent will diverge and develop into other things. And so the idea that follows from that is something called common descent. That is, organisms living today can trace their ancestry to organisms that lived in the misty past, and they developed into different branches by this process of variation and selection. A very key and often unstated premise, though, of Darwin's theory is that this happens by chance. Nobody is planning these variations, nobody pointedly including God, and that this is just the way organisms develop. As they develop variations, and selection does the rest. This can be contrasted with, say, Lamarckian evolution, and in Lamarckian evolution, named after Lamarck, who proposed it, organisms can develop as they try to do things over time. And the classic example of Lamarckian evolution is maybe over time, precursors of giraffes strained to get to eat leaves on higher and higher branches of trees. And as they did it, they kind of made themselves have a little longer neck, and their offspring inherited this. And then they kept doing it over the generations until we have what we have today. You can have other things where you can have an unfolding where it is teleological, where it is built into the universe by either, the universe itself is teleological, or God instilled, this ability into the universe to unfold. And there are other, but the critical difference between all of these is what is the proposed mechanism of how change happens. Mm-hmm. Darwin's is actually the clearest mechanism I can think of. Yeah. The other ones, I think Darwin's mechanism is completely inadequate, but it's at least clear, and the other ones are inadequate and unclear. Yeah. The Lamarckian is unclear how that works, and other ones, even today, people are proposing new mechanisms for the development, for evolution. There's a whole line of thought called the extended evolutionary synthesis. Darwin's idea these days has a nickname, the evolutionary synthesis, and these guys, the extended evolutionary synthesis, trying to say, oh, we're just building on what came before. But there's a number of, I won't go into them, but there's a number of proposed mechanisms there, and it's often very unclear how they're really supposed to work. But Darwin's is, he's the king of the hill. right now, even though there's a lot of murmuring about how it doesn't explain this or that. I think because at least his mechanism is clear. There are some examples where it does work for little things, but it does work for some things. And it's makes that the default position.
Sure. Yeah, I read the whole Origin of Species, and one of the things that struck me is he really extrapolates stupendously, because I mean the kind of variations that he's observing is the fur color, feather shapes, beak shapes, all variations within a species, and relatively minor, and oftentimes detrimental variations too. Like when he was an expert in pigeon breeding, I think it was, or dove breeding, pretty much the same thing. And but these exotic feathers that would sometimes arise that were corkscrew shaped, or very pretty for human connoisseurs of animal breeding, but functionally terrible, functionally detrimental. Like this poor pigeon with all these curly Q feathers is not going to survive in the wild because it can barely fly, because there's really a genetic disease, essentially, is what it has. But it seems key to me that Darwin argues about, well, these small changes, and maybe some of these small changes given a survival advantage, and so the descendants all those descendants with that variation outcompete all others, and it becomes fixed in the population. That all sounds unobjectionable, but then he adds to it an additional assumption, which is, well, this can explain everything now. This explains eyes, this explains kidneys, this explains, brains. Yeah, everything is explicable. It's like, hold on a minute. That's a huge extrapolation.
Just emphasize your point. Yeah, on his voyage on the HMS Beagle, he saw in the Galapagos Islands actually a couple of different species of mockingbirds. Mockingbirds. Each one different from the others and different from the species of mockingbird that was in South America. And he scratched his head, or later on anyway, and said, well, if some of them had flown here, and variation and selection over time, we could get this blackbird and that blackbird and that blackbird. Great, yeah, hey, maybe good idea, maybe so. And then he says, well, maybe all the species of blackbird in the whole world descended from the same process. You say, oh, okay, okay. Well, let's look at no, wait, and maybe all birds descended from a similar, and maybe all animals. So these, he took his idea and he ran with it. Right. What you might call his specific theory of evolution by natural selection. That is, smallest changes where you can get dog breeds, you can get species of Galapagos finches, Galapagos mockingbirds, things like that. Okay, everybody agrees that can happen. It's these crazy extrapolations, which I should say have a total amount of evidence of zero to back it up, that is problematic. But somehow he seemed to have caught a social current, and it became a very popular idea.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the major problems, of course, for him was the fossil record, which doesn't show the gradual transitions that his theory demanded. His theory really demanded innumerable successive slight variations, I think is the phrase that he uses, or something very close to that in Origin of Species. He really held the position that, when you move from, say, fish to frog, like every transition would be almost imperceptible. But at the end of that very smooth, high-resolution process, you end up with a frog at the end where you began with a fish. Of course, the fossil record doesn't show that at all. We have fish already abruptly appearing in the Cambrian explosion, and then we have other, new forms throughout. We have an explosion of flowering plants at a certain point in the biostratigraphic column. We have many explosions, a mammal explosion, a bird explosion, where all these new forms show up at once without good candidates for their ancestors below them in the fossil record, much less a nice high-resolution chain of transition. And actually, what really convinced me about this was, ironically, Jerry Coyne. In his book, Why Evolution is True, I thought that I would get a lot of diagrams. I mean, he even has like an attempted diagram here of a chain of forms, But anyway, he's got about a half a dozen diagrams similar to this in the book. And I analyzed them all, and about half of the diagrams just show trivial changes within a species, like a shellfish gaining an additional chamber over several million years. Not too exciting. And the other diagrams, like he has one of birds, and it showed two forms that were contemporaneous, and then the modern chicken. So he has Archaeopteryx and Compsognathus, which lived at the same time.
Yeah.
Well, he puts them in his diagram as if Archaeopteryx is a stepping stone to the modern chicken. But if you actually do the research, you find out no, Archaeopteryx and Compsognathus, which is the presumable ancestor, actually lived at the same time, so they don't represent succession.
Yeah.
They lived at the same time, and then you jump to the chicken. So that's not a high resolution, smooth grade, sequence. And then he has a diagram of whale evolution, which is a mess because he has them out of order, not in temporal sequence, and then. And he's got brackets on the side, and if you understand what the brackets mean, they mean that all the actual transitions and ancestors are missing, and these are actually a succession of dead ends that only look like a putative ancestor, which we've never found in the fossil record. So anyway, so we don't have this. We don't have those transitions, unfortunately, we just don't. And so nature seems to be telling us that things appear to happen suddenly.
One other thing I think you alluded to is that what we do seem to see, I'm not a paleontologist, but
Right.
I read that one sees disparity, quote unquote, before diversity, quote unquote, and that those words were made up by Stephen Jay Gould, I believe, to indicate diversity is the spread of forms within a species or within a family, and disparity is the higher level differences there. And one sees in the fossil record real big changes, which go on then to fill in smaller changes from the primordial type, which is exactly the opposite, as you said, of what we would expect in a Darwinian view. It looks more like, if I might get ahead, something was put there and it started to fill the niches by devolution rather than evolution, by unfolding stuff that was in its programs already, rather than acquiring new information.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So to reiterate it, in the Cambrian explosion, which is the level in the geological column where in most places in the world we first see fossils. There are some places where we have a few below. That's a different story. But in most places in the world, the fossils show up in the Cambrian rock layer. And that's the beginning of fossils in the geological column. And when we look there, we see almost all the phyla of living animals are already present. And a phyla is a group of animals that share a body plan. So if you have an exoskeleton, you're generally an arthropod, so insects and shellfish that, have exoskeletons. And if you've got an internal skeleton, you're a chordate, and that's a phylum. And mollusks are a phylum, and so on. So all the major body plans, which are very different from one another, how do you change from having a skeleton to having an exoskeleton? How does that take place by a series of small changes? Well, it's not only is it hard to understand how you could, but in the fossil record, we don't see things with an exoskeleton below things with an internal skeleton. They show up at the same time in the Cambrian, along with a whole bunch of other different kinds of creatures that have different body plans. And so that's disparity. That's like big differences, like differences in how the animal is built from the ground up. And as you rightly point out, Darwin's theory predicts that what we should find at the bottom of the fossil record is just different species of the same thing, small differences. And then as we go up the fossil record, those small differences should grow into big differences. And actually, we start with big differences, and then we kind of fill in with diversity, which is variations within those big categories. And that kind of defies what we would expect from the theory.
Yeah. One other aspect of that I was reminded of is that the Cambrian explosion is called that because it seemed to happen all at once, and you got everything in a short period of time. And estimates I've seen is it's around 10 million years or less. And people say, well, 10 million years, that's a lot of time, but one should compare it to other things that we know about evolution in that kind of time. For example, on the Galapagos Islands, people know there are these finches, they call Darwin finches, and they were made famous by a series of books. And one book was called The Beak of the Finch, which written by a guy named Jonathan Weider about the work of Peter and Rosemary Grant at Princeton University, who studied them for a long time. And they showed that they studied the birds, and then there was a severe drought on the islands one year, and they showed that the succeeding population of one species of ground finch had their beaks were 5% bigger than they were. And then rains came along, and then the average population went back. But, you have a number of species. What people miss is that those finches have been on the Galapagos Islands for 2 million years. And they're descended from a finch, species. Yeah. And in 2 million years, they have been just kind of fluttering back and forth.
Back and forth.
Even though there's this horrendous, selective pressure, half the population can die off in a year when rains don't come or some other variable changes. And any mutation that had come along in that time that would, make it a finch into a condor or make it into a something between a fish and a bird, or let your imagination go wild. I mean, evolution has produced all this, right?
Right.
It could do anything, but we see absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
And I've written a little bit about these other they call luxuriantly evolving species that show the same pattern. Another one is things called cichlid fishes.
Yeah.
In Africa. They're all members of the same family. They've a bunch of them developed over something like 15,000 years, but they never go beyond relatively minor changes, even though they go real fast, real quickly, but then they get stuck in the mud. Oh. And so it makes you suspect that things like the Cambrian explosion have to be explained by other processes than that.
There's just, yeah. Yeah, there's more. There's I can share with you a paper on the Darwin finches that recent genetic studies show that those variations in coloration and beak size are almost certainly epigenetic, and that there's very little genetic variation of any substance between all those different races of finch on the islands. But that's a whole another tall weeds discussion.
Yeah, right.
Okay, Mike, it's that time in the program where I want to move through your three major books, and you've got other books out there as well. But I think it's a good way because the books do show a progression of your thought over the decades, and so it's a good way to get into what has been your major contribution to the discussion of creation, design, evolution, and so on. So let's start with Darwin's Black Box that made a huge splash in 1996 and was Christianity Today's Book of the Year. And as we talked early in the program, for a couple of years, it seemed like there was an openness before the powers that be kind of circled the wagons and, or the empire struck back, as you said, and it became clear that the Academy wasn't going to tolerate discussions of design because it did threaten the materialist meta-narrative that the institutions of higher learning in our culture are deeply committed to. But anyway, can you talk to us about what led to the writing of this book and what are the major ideas that you promoted in the book?
Well, let's see. I was just a normal scientist doing my regular research, and in the later 1980s, I read a book called Evolution, a Theory in Crisis by a geneticist named Michael Denton. And he was an agnostic at the time, but nonetheless, he was tired of Darwinists claiming for their theory so much when he saw so many problems for it. And he listed a number of things in his book. And I happened to read that book, and I got mad because I had been taught throughout my education that we got this. We know how life developed, certainly in many details. And that was by Darwin's mechanism of evolution by natural selection. And I'm a biochemist. Biochemistry studies the molecular basis of life. And in studying biochemistry, you see lots of extremely complex and sophisticated systems that are responsible for various cellular or other activities. And I remember reading about them and saying to myself, well, gee, I wonder how that evolved. And then saying, well, I guess somebody knows, and flipping the page, kind of like what I did with my lab mate Joanne Nickel about the origin of life. So I had been, stymied because I presumed that somebody had this in hand. But after reading this book, I said, well, who has explained these things? And then I went to the science library on the campus of Lehigh University, where I work, to look up articles explaining where blood clotting came from, where the bacterial flagellum or cilium came from, and so on. And I expected to see a few attempts here and there, maybe some open questions left, but I was astounded that there was nothing on any of the things that I wrote about, no complex biochemical systems. At best, you'd get somebody saying, well, isn't it wonderful what evolution has produced for us at the end of an article talking about these astounding activities. And right then, like I say, I got mad because I thought I was being misled. And once you start to doubt Darwin's theory for the explanation of life, and you know the molecular basis of life, it takes about 10 minutes for you to decide that this must have been designed, just because of how elegant it is. It's kind of the signature of a mind. So I was quickly turned against that and in favor of design, but I didn't do anything. Pretty much I went up and down the halls of the chemistry department trying to buttonhole people and say, "Hey, look at you," and they would kind of smile and then kind of back away slowly. So I didn't have anything to do, but serendipitously, I met a guy named Philip Johnson, who was a University of California, Berkeley law professor, who himself had come to a similar realization and had written a book about it. And he found out about me because I wrote a letter to the editor of Science magazine about a slam, a slamming article they wrote about one of his books, and I got pulled into his circle, and he was a schmoozer, and he gathered people around who were of like mind, who were willing to believe in Darwinism, but saw that the evidence was not there. And by associating with those people, among whom were a lot of philosophers and historians and engineers and so on, I came to think, hey, maybe I could write a book too, because scientists don't write books; they write articles. And I had something to say that nobody else had been thinking about. And what I had to say was, the title of the book is Darwin's Black Box, and the black box is a term that's used in science to mean a system or something that's doing something really cool, but you don't know how it works because you can't see inside the box. Maybe you got a box where something comes in one side and something else goes out the other, but you don't know what went on there. And it turns out that the cell was a black box to Darwin. And the point of the book was to show what has turned out to be discovered by science in the cell, these fantastic machines that are responsible for running it, to detail a number of the machines and to explain why they are extremely resistant to Darwin's mechanism of gradual evolution by random changes and natural selection. And the big point of the book was something called irreducible complexity. And that sounds fancy, but it just means that you've got something that needs a number of parts to work, and that if you don't have all the parts, it's broken. Doesn't work. And a good example of it is a mouse trap, a mechanical mouse trap. I've got a picture in there. You take away one of the parts and it doesn't work. And then I showed why a number of molecular machines also fit that same bill. And then I went on to argue that a better explanation is for purposeful, intelligent design. Because whenever we see parts arranged for a purpose, that's how we conclude that a mind has acted, that there has been design, purposeful design. And it actually was received reasonably well. It got a lot of notice, as you mentioned, a lot of reviews and so on. And people then felt free to say reasonably positive things about the possibility of design, and also to admit that science did not, at least yet, they said, know how such things could arise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then there was a backlash. How long did it take for the backlash to kick in?
It took a few years, actually.
Yeah.
I was, back in those days, got a fair number of invitations to universities to talk and to conferences, even from religious conferences and so on. So people wanted to hear about this new stuff. Things started to go south when the public started to act on this. And parents in many places were mad, like I was, that their kids were being taught to believe something and the evidence was not what they had been assured that it was. And so there were various moves afoot to get school districts and other places to start discussing the problems with Darwin's theory and the possibilities of intelligent design. And that's when the institutional science organized. Before they pretty much were disorganized, nobody did anything. A lot of people didn't like it, but they were disorganized. But now the National Academy of Sciences, something called the National Center for Science uh, uh, science education, and other organizations did the legwork of getting people together, of having statements issued, of issuing statements to governors and government organizations to stop this. In one instance, it resulted in a federal trial in Pennsylvania, where a school board had directed biology teachers to say that, well, there's a book on intelligent design in the library that you might want to read, or words to that effect. And they were sued, and there was this big old trial. I was a witness for the school board and stuff, and the court ruled against it. Essentially, they copied the statement that was given to them by the other attorneys, kind of casting things in the worst possible light for intelligent design. And pretty much since then, ID has had a much lower public profile.
Mm-hmm.
And that's interesting and stuff, but I'm a scientist, and I don't care what a judge writes about the bacterial flagellum or the blood clotting cascade.
It hasn't been explained.
No, I mean there, and it's, as we record, is the year 82026, 30 years after I wrote Darwin's Black Box, in which I specifically challenged people with these examples, and none of them have received any explanation. We're no closer to understanding how those things originated than decades ago.
Yeah. So as I see it in the book, you're basically pointing out that Darwin's explanation works well for things that can be achieved in successive small steps. Mm-hmm. But when you're dealing with systems, systems require many things to be present all at the same time. A skyscraper is a good example of a system. You have to have a foundation, you have to have plumbing, you have to have electricity, you have to have HVAC, you have to have a skin on the building, you have to have a structural system like girders and so on. If any of those things are missing, it's not habitable. Mm-hmm. To translate that to life, habitability in a building might be comparable to being alive as a living organism. And so for an organism to be alive, there's many things have to be present all at the same time. And in the stepwise progression, it's not alive until you get to the end and it goes live. We even use that phrase, something goes live. That means it's complete, it's ready to be turned on. And so certainly the first cell is a huge challenge to explain by a Darwinian mechanism, and we've already alluded to that. That's the problem with the origin of life, and we're no closer to explaining that by materialist means than we were in 1953 or 52 when Miller and Urey did their, found some amino acids, which is just a very, very tiny small step. But then within the cell, there are many, many, many systems that are active, and organelles, and nanomachines, and so on. And all of them require many parts to be present at once before they can work at all. And a stepwise progression up to them is just a series of things that don't work yet. Mm-hmm. And if they don't work yet, they have no value to the organism. So this is a huge challenge because Darwin's theory requires that each step in the process of evolution bestows a benefit on the organism. But if the organism is, for example, trying to develop a heart or a kidney or an eye or an ear, or the analogous organs at a cellular level, the organism doesn't benefit at all during the stepwise building of those things. So the question is, if, during the process of the development of those things, how is natural selection going to encourage the continued development of this system when the system doesn't confer an advantage on the organism until it's actually complete? So and that's a more complicated way of getting at what you were talking about by irreducible complexity. It's like the system has a certain minimal number of parts that all have to be present for it to have any value at all to the living thing. And so prior to that, natural selection has nothing to select on because it's not, the system's incomplete and it's not conferring a survival advantage. Is that essentially?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, and again, I back to a mousetrap. You ask yourself, how would you build a mousetrap by Darwin's mechanism of many small steps, he said, numerous successive small steps. Yeah, and would you start with, say, the wooden platform and hope to catch mice inefficiently? Maybe the mouse would trip as it ran across the floor, and then what would you do? Add the spring, but what's the spring going to work on? And so natural selection needs something working to select, and you got to do gradually better and better and better. And it's interesting that after the book came out, there was a small cottage industry on the internet of people trying to build mousetraps gradually, and none of them worked. I mean, they would do something silly and then declare victory, but if you look at them with the least amount of skepticism, you'd see this would never work. And again, decades down the line, it seems trivial, but the kicker is that we people who have minds can put things together. We want to make a mousetrap, we'll put this here, that here, and there it is. But if there's no direction, Chance might as well throw this away. Whoops, excuse me. Chance might as well throw something away, or why keep this thing here if it's not doing anything? And it's extremely difficult. Darwin's positing of chance and selection was a huge intellectual leap into the dark, and it has not panned out.
Yeah, I think you demonstrated that very well in the book. It seems to me that if you're trying to explain things by a Darwinian mechanism, you're trying to do engineering under an enormous constraint. You're trying to engineer things, and the constraint is every single change you make to what you're building has to confer an immediate advantage. And that's not how we build things. When you think of a car going through a manufacturing plant, when they're adding things onto the chassis, the benefit of each bolt, of each piece that's placed onto the chassis is not apparent until at least certain systems of the car are complete. And until all the systems of the car are complete, it is not a viable vehicle. What if everything on your Cadillac is fine except the steering? You do not have a viable car. What if everything on the Cadillac is lovely except the brakes? You do not have a viable car. And for many of us, that would go all the way to air conditioning. If the air conditioning is not working, I'm not going to drive that thing because the humidity is just so bad in the summer in Steubenville. That's not a viable vehicle. So you could have a lovely creation that, again, everything is correct except, maybe even the backup camera. For my wife, that's a game breaker. If it doesn't have a backup camera, it's not a viable vehicle. So all of these things have to be in place. And you could argue, maybe a teenager would be content with a dune buggy, which would have a lot less things. And that's true. But even a dune buggy has a lot of systems that all have to be operational. Certainly steering, braking, There's a
And
minimal.
you don't make a Cadillac from a dune buggy by adding
But,
one screw at a time.
right, and each addition of a screw, or in the case of a Cadillac to a dune buggy, it would be devolution, which you talk
Yeah,
about later.
yeah.
Actually, that would probably something you could probably strip down a Cadillac until you had a dune buggy, but going the other direction would be difficult. But yeah, but each additional bolt, each additional screw, each additional little part, it's not going to confer a noticeable benefit until at least systems are complete on the vehicle. So anyway, we talked about Darwin's black box and irreducible complexity, and then your next book, what was it, about 10 years later?
Yes,
Was
it was 2007, 11 years after the first. Yeah.
Sure, The Edge of Evolution, and what led to the writing of this, and what does this book contribute that the black box didn't?
Well, the progress of science actually contributed to this. I had said all pretty much I had to say with Darwin's black box, but more and more information keeps coming out. So one big question, if you're a person like me who thinks that, well, there's design in life, these elegant systems I describe, but you can have smaller changes, and certainly Darwinism, while it can't explain everything, it can explain some things. One thing it can explain nicely is something I actually studied in graduate school: sickle cell hemoglobin. People with sickle cell anemia have a changed hemoglobin, which is changed in just one amino acid residue out of hundreds of amino acid residues. But that's enough to give them, give people that have one normal hemoglobin gene and one mutant gene, gives them a little bit of resistance to malaria. But of course, if you got two, then you have the sickle cell disease, and that's usually fatal as well. So the point is, chance and selection can explain some things, and some medically important things like sickle cell. And
so sickle cell spread, because it has an advantage that it confers, at least the heterozygous form, if I'm understanding that correctly, confers resistance to malaria. You just got to hope that you're not the 1 in 4 that gets both mutants from your parents, and you end up with the disease.
Exactly. So it's a wonderful example of Darwinian evolution.
Right.
But one should notice that it's a crummy solution because 1 in 4 of your kids will die. Additionally, it's a change that it's not in the immune system. Malaria, small pathogens are usually dealt with by the immune system. This is like throwing the kitchen sink at something rather than an elegant change. But so the question I wanted to address was, well, where is the edge of evolution? Where's the borderline, the rough borderline between what chance can explain and what required intelligence, design? And I got interested in this in malaria because of my work as in my doctoral studies. I worked on sickle hemoglobin. I've always been interested in it. And the drug that was used against malaria for the longest time was something called chloroquine. And it was invented in the 1940s, and it cured people left and right. It was a wonder drug, and people thought that malaria would be eliminated like viral diseases and smallpox and stuff. But then it started to lose its effectiveness, and turns out that malaria was developing resistance to it. And then in the 1970s, there was an article called "Requiem for Chloroquine" in one of the journals. It was no longer effective. So I wanted to know, what did it take for malaria to develop resistance to chloroquine? Turns out people had naively thought, well, chloroquine, yeah, we'll just get another drug. But almost all the other drugs that folks tried as substitutes were rapidly rendered ineffective by malaria developing resistance to them.
Mm.
So there is one drug called atovaquone. If you give it to folks that have malaria in a clinic, about 1 out of every 3 of them it won't be effective on, because the malaria in the person will develop resistance and then propagate and take over. With malaria, it's about 1 in every billion people that develop, with chloroquine, it's 1 every billion people who develop resistance to that. So a factor of 100 million fold or so in the difference. And I thought that this would be a great system, to try and see what the limits are of evolution, because in each person who's sick with malaria, there are 1 trillion malaria cells. So evolution has lots and lots of chances to come up with mutations that might do something good. And in every year, about 100 million people get sick with malaria. So that's, if you do the math notation, that's 10 to the 20th malarial cells on Earth in a year. That's an astronomical, beyond astronomical number of cells. So evolution has all this opportunity to do something really, really impressive. And it turns out that in the early 2000s, people identified what the mutations were that allowed the malaria to resist chloroquine. And let me preface by saying that proteins, which are the machinery of the cell, are composed of amino acids. They're the subunits. They're 20 amino acids. They're strung together. And usually proteins are 100 to a few hundred of these amino acids strung together in a chain. And it turns out that for atovaquone to develop resistance to that other drug, malaria needed to change 1 amino acid residue in 1 particular protein. And given 10 to the 12 chances in a person, it could do that pretty easily. I won't go through the math, but trust me on it. Yeah. And it turns out that with chloroquine, you needed 2.
Now there's 2.
2 out of hundreds, this one and this one. So just needing 1 more lousy amino acid change decreased the probability of getting resistance by over 100 million. How can that be? Well, it turns out that the DNA, the length of DNA in a malarial cell is about 100 million. If you got to change 1 of them, you have a chance in 100 million and getting this first one. Well, what if you have to change 2? You have to chance 1 in 100 million times 1 in 100 million to get 2. So the likelihood goes down exponentially the more you need to get. And it's important to realize these are tiny changes in pre-existing proteins that were already there. So I essentially had my edge of evolution. If something doesn't have a selected helpful intermediate, and you've got to have both at the same time, as was the case for this malaria resistance, Darwinism, quickly fades away. And so I wrote that the edge of evolution, that even in the whole history of life, we wouldn't expect 2 proteins to be able to, 3 proteins to develop new binding relationships to each other. It's kind of like if you're going to build Lego structures, getting 3 of them to hook together, because the odds of doing it are more than the chances that would be available in the whole history of life. So I tried to, move the ball forward by saying, yeah, okay, we can, certainly there are these things that Darwinism can't build, which I talked about in the first, but if you're below this edge, well, you can change some things around the edges. So
Yeah.
that was the gist of that.
So yeah, so things that are accomplishable by a single mutation, yeah, evolution could probably do that.
Uh-huh.
Things that are accomplishable by two mutations, neither of which by itself confers any advantage on the organism,
Uh-huh.
that's about the limit of what it can do. And if it required three or more, you can just forget it in the whole history of life.
That's
Because of especially with organisms that reproduce much more slowly, like human beings,
right.
and so on. So, and when you think about the number of mutations that would be required to create a new organism, a new organ, like a swim, like a bladder in a fish to allow it to affect its buoyancy, you know. I wouldn't even begin to know how to calculate the math on that, or the number of mutations that would be required for an organ like that, or the heat sensing pits that snakes have that confer upon them essentially infrared visions that they can see in the dark, the heat pattern of their prey. Certainly there's tens of thousands of mutations would be involved in creating a structure like that for a snake, and many thousands of those are going to have to be coordinated before it's going to confer a real survival advantage on the animal. So you can see the daunting challenge that a mindless process like evolution would have in developing that, even within the the standard ages that are given for the earth and for life forms. So good. So that's the edge of evolution. And then I don't have your most recent book here at hand, your 2020 book called Darwin Devolves. Kind of clever title. What is that book about, and what does it add that the edge of evolution didn't have? And
well, again, it was due to the development of science along the way. I'm not making these things up as I go along. It's as science knows more about pertinent topics, then that gives me an opportunity to write. And it turns out that science has not been able to evaluate Darwin's theory until about 20 years or so ago, because Darwin's theory depends on mutations, which are changes in molecules. Darwin didn't know about molecules. He didn't know what the mechanism of inheritance was. He didn't know about DNA, anything like that. It turns out later on, people discovered that DNA was the repository of genetic information, and that mutations were changes in the sequence of the DNA molecule, and these then coded for proteins. And so it was changes in DNA that caused changes in the machinery of the cell. Well, what changes? People couldn't do that. Back in the 1940s, 50s, in the middle of the 20th century, people could study evolution by seeing, bunny rabbits, one in a litter of brown ones, there might be a white one, and there are farmers might graze animals and see mutations. So huge observable changes. But since Darwin's mechanism has to operate at the molecular level, to have a good evaluation of the range of what it can do, you have to track changes, know what they are, and see how they develop over time. And that was essentially impossible to do much before the turn of the 21st century. And in the 1990s, nonetheless, there was a man named Richard Lenski who started an interesting experiment at Michigan State University where he would grow bacteria in a flask overnight, and the bacteria would go through 6 generations in just one day, because they reproduce quickly because they're so small, and also because they're so small, there's a lot of them around. Can be 100 million cells in just one small flask. And he had a dozen flasks that he treated separately just for replicability's sake. So he let them grow overnight. And then the next morning he came in, took a portion of that and put it into new media, new food, and let them grow for another day. Then he did the same thing the next day, and the next day, and the next day. And since the 1990s, they've gone through over 80,000 generations, and there have been trillions of these cells. And during this time, science developed the ability to track down and sequence the changes in DNA that mutations cause. In the early work, Lenski couldn't do that because techniques weren't there. So he would see that, well, cells would grow faster than the parent cells, or cells, were bigger in volume than the starting cells. So he knew there were mutations going on, but he didn't know what they were. But around the year 2000, he tracked down the first one, which made cells grow significantly faster, about 5% faster. Doesn't sound like much, but that means it takes over the flask in just 20 generations. Mm-hmm. And he had his lab track down the molecular changes, and it turns out that in the 3 million or so nucleotides that this bacteria had, called E. coli, a small segment were genes that were involved in the metabolism of something called ribose, which is a little sugar. And they saw that those genes for ribose were broken. They were thrown away. They weren't there anymore. And that was it. So the take-home lesson is that throwing away genetic information can sometimes help something grow faster. It can make it more fit to its environment.
This would be like yachts racing towards a finish line, and one yacht decides, well, we'll start throwing out our food supply or baggage or whatever.
Exactly.
And it lightens up the ship, and we're 5% faster, and so we cross the finish line first, which is great if your goal is just to win the race, but long term, you might question the advisability of having thrown that out. So did this cause the E. coli to lose the ability to synthesize ribose?
Yes, that's right. That's right. I'm sorry. It lost the ability to metabolize the ribose.
Metabolize it.
Yeah.
And why did that cause them to replicate faster?
Nobody quite knows, but it spends some energy trying to make those proteins and keep that system up and going. So if it throws that away, it has energy it can use for other things.
Right. Living in the flax, it just didn't
right.
benefit that much from the ability to...
That's right. It was given other foodstuffs than ribose. It was given glucose, which is a favorite form of food, sugar for the bugs. So it could do without that.
It could do without ribose, yeah.
But as the experiment proceeded, they identified a total of 30 of the most highly effective mutations over the course of 25 years or so, and they were able to track down all of them with the newly developed sequencing techniques. And all of them either broke genes outright or degraded their ability to perform. There was nothing that was on the way to building some new molecular machine or something constructive. They were all degradative, and that's why I titled the book Darwin Devolves, because it turns out that the Darwin's mechanism actually works by squandering genetic information for short-term gain. Whatever will help, if we get rid of it, we'll throw that away. Mm-hmm. And at one point I liken it to an heir, a profligate heir who inherits a fortune and just spends freely, and it's great. He can buffer himself against the slings and arrows of fortune, But when the inheritance runs out, then he's in big trouble.
Yeah.
And breaking a gene is not the opposite of making one. It gives you no information about how those things could be made. It's like another analogy I use is if suppose there were an army coming to invade your city, and your city was across the river, and there was one bridge connecting your city to the rest of the land. What's a good way to defend your city? It's to blow up the bridge. Now they can't come over, and you live to fight another day. And that's a positive change for people living in the city, but it does not tell you how to build a bridge.
Right.
And it turns
And there's
out
many more ways to destroy a bridge than there are to build it.
exactly. Yeah.
And it takes
that's
much
right.
less planning.
Uh-huh.
You can blow it up, you can set it on fire, you can chop it down,
Uh-huh.
and analogously, if a organism can benefit by throwing something out, there's many more ways to break a system than there are to build it. And I follow what you're saying, and I've looked into, I've tried to track down all of the known examples in animals of adaptive changes where scientists have had the time and the leisure and the resources to actually track down the molecular basis of the change or the genetic basis of the change. And all of the examples that I have looked at have been adaptive loss of function. That is, something was broken, something was shut off, and surprisingly, it conferred a benefit on the organism to have that shut down. So examples would be hairless dogs in Mexico where it's very hot, or polar bears losing their color, or eyeless cavefish where a mutation will shut down the eye development, and that turns out to be advantageous because their eyes are worthless in the dark anyway. So on and on, things of that nature. And I've asked scientists, I even wrote to a Harvard, I think he's a biologist, showed you that paper before the show, who wrote on the fact of this, this devolution or this adaptive loss of function, and asked if he had any examples of gain of function that in the literature. Of course, he didn't respond to my query, and neither did any of the other. One scientist gave me 4 papers, and I read deeply into them and found out that although the headline made it sound like there had been a gain of function, when you actually look at the molecular or the genetic basis of the change, you find out it was a loss of function. So
interesting. New York Times in the past 10 years or so, there have been a number of stories about how humans are evolving. One about how, I think it's the Amish can resist heart attacks. And in this one lineage of Amish folks, nobody's ever had a heart attack, and it's because of this change in this one gene that is involved in lipid metabolism. You look up the paper, the gene is broken in these folks, and a number of examples like it's with dogs. Reviewing my book, The Edge of Evolution, for the New York Times, Richard Dawkins reviewed my book, and he's slamming it left and right, and he was talking about why look at all these dog breeds that and there's a pack of dogs baying, laughing at Behe for his naivety. Real, kind of nasty stuff. But in the past 10 years, because of developments in the techniques of genome sequencing, people have sequenced the genomes of breeds of dogs.
They're all broken.
And they're all broken. They're
all broken wolves.
All their distinctive characteristics. Chihuahuas have genes, broken growth hormone genes. Right. Huge dogs have broken genes that tell the body when to stop growing. Right. Boxers have broken genes involved in facial development.
Yeah, so they're all genetically diseased wolves.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it turns out, and you can modify a bunch of characteristics: size, shape, color, by breaking things rather than making new stuff.
Right.
And the very important point of this, is that these broken genes are spread by natural selection. So they will eliminate the whole gene in the whole population if the process goes to completion. So not only do they don't make something, they're devolving, they're decreasing the genetic complexity of it.
Right. And the end of that is extinction.
Yes.
When you squander all of your genetic heritage. And this is not showing us how we build, this is showing us how we tear something down. Of course, it makes sense with the second law of thermodynamics and entropy, which is kind of seems like a universal principle. So, but we got to kind of wrap up and try to draw this to a close. So in the end, we're saying to build something, you need a mind. To create the beautiful, complex, purposeful organisms that we see in biology, it takes a genius. It takes a creative genius, and that's a testament ultimately to God. Now, does this, well, only a few minutes to talk about, does this affect our reading of Scripture? Do you think it makes a difference if we approach the Bible as, say, a theistic evolutionist versus being an intelligent design theorist? Do you think it makes a difference, or is it like, in the end, I'm not sure?
Well, I don't know. I can't speak for theistic evolutionists because I'm not one. I can talk about I went from being theistic evolution-y because I didn't think much about the issue to being a design proponent, and say it hasn't really affected my reading of the Bible. Maybe because I'm just not thinking deeply enough.
Yeah.
I'm no theologian, no philosopher. But it does give you a much greater appreciation for the power and the mind of God, that, the more you know about how life works. And this is not like, God invented a kaleidoscope where you jumble it up and gives you no patterns. All these details had to be right, that for life to exist, it's not only got to be fine-tuning in the universe and the structure of the solar system and the structure of the earth and the origin of life. You need details going into the phylogeny and the orders and families and all down to very small details, and that God is, intimately involved in, pretty much all details of life on earth. So depends on how deeply you think about these things. But
certainly passages like Romans 1:18 and following, where it talks about the invisible qualities of God being evident from the nature.
Yeah.
Certainly that resonates more strongly after pursuing the trajectories of thought that you've worked on in your career. Which, so yes, indeed, when you get down, especially when you get the more detailed you get, the more you realize that there had to have been a creative intelligence behind what we see. So you're seeing testimony to that from the natural world. And passages like John 1, where all things are made through the Word, through the Logos, that certainly has to resonate more strongly when you have a healthy respect for the challenges of explaining things merely through law and chance versus having the recourse to a mind.
Yeah, it certainly is much more concrete.
Yeah.
God didn't just say, "Oh, you guys be and do what you want." He said, right. This is what I want. And these are the details I want. And I guess it'd give you a different impression too about people who say God doesn't sweat the small stuff. No, God is intimately interested and involved in all the details, and there's no reason to think that this is the limit of his interests, or planning even the molecular machinery and stuff that we can clearly identify as beyond chance. There is excellent reason to think that God is involved in everything.
Yeah, so when we have statements of our Lord, like he knows every sparrow that falls or every hair on our head, when you work with biochemistry
Yeah.
at this molecular level, we're like, yeah, pretty much,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
these very small nanomachines
Yeah.
required a mind to design them.
I was think that when God rested, he counted the hairs on my head.
It's kind of an easy task.
Yeah.
Increasingly easy
Take the day off.
as the years go on. Yeah. Well, Dr. Michael Behe, very great pleasure to have you on the show, and very grateful for you making the time
Wonderful.
to be present with us.
Thanks very much. It was a great conversation.